Hurry, your son's unconscious. The trembling voice of his maid's daughter shattered the billionaire's perfect world, and what he did next left everyone speechless. It started with a phone call no parent ever expects. Hello? Is this Mr. Vance? The voice was faint, trembling, uncertain, the kind that makes you lower your volume just to hear it better. Arthur Vance glanced at the phone. Unknown number. He never answered those. But something, that quiet pressure in the chest that warns you before the storm hits, made him swipe. Speaking. Who is this? My name's Lily, the voice said. I'm Maria's daughter. Your maid. He frowned, impatient. What is it? There was a pause, then a whisper that sliced straight through the hum of his office. It's your son, sir. He's not waking up. The sound of a chair scraping back. The sharp slam of glass. A man who could buy anything, suddenly powerless. In the space between one breath and the next, Arthur Vance's life split cleanly in two. This is the story of how a billionaire lost everything he thought mattered and found what truly did. And before I forget, where are you watching from today? Leave a comment below. We love seeing how far these stories reach. Enjoy the story. A single phone call can shatter a life of carefully built silence. The little girl's voice was a whisper, a tiny, fragile thing nearly lost in the static of a bad connection. But for Arthur Vance, a man who moved markets with a single word, that whisper was louder than a thunderclap. The call came at 3:17 p.m., a time when Arthur was usually deep in the abyss of quarterly reports and stock projections. His office, a glass-walled sanctuary on the 80th floor, was silent except for the hum of the city far below. He stared at the phone, an unknown number with a local area code. He never answered those. His assistant, a ruthlessly efficient woman named Helen, filtered his world. But something made him swipe right. A strange, cold feeling in the pit of his stomach. Hello, he said, his voice clipped and impatient. A pause. Then a small, shaky voice. Is this Mr. Vance? Speaking. Who is this? My name is Lily, the voice said, followed by a sniffle. I know you don't know me, but I'm Maria's daughter. Your maid. Arthur frowned. Maria? The quiet woman who cleaned his penthouse twice a week. He barely saw her. She was just a part of the seamless, silent machinery of his life. What is it, Lily? Another pause, this one filled with a choked sob. It's your son, she whispered. It's Leo? He's unconscious. Please, you have to hurry. Arthur's world tilted. The numbers on his screen blurred into meaningless squiggles. He stood so fast his chair shot back, slamming against the polished mahogany of his desk. What did you say? He asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. We're at the park, she said, her words tumbling out now. The one by the old oak tree. He fell from the climbing frame. He hit his head. There's blood, Mr. Vance. He won't wake up. Arthur didn't remember hanging up. He just dropped the phone and moved. He stormed past Helen, who jumped to her feet, her face a mask of alarm. Sir? Mr. Vance. He didn't answer. He was already in his private elevator, his hand shaking as he pressed the button for the garage. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, wild drumbeat. Leo, his son, his quiet, thoughtful, 10-year-old son, who he saw for an hour a day, if he was lucky. The park was only 10 blocks from his office, but it felt like a world away. He drove his black sedan with a recklessness that made other drivers honk and swerve. He saw the ambulance first, its lights flashing silently, a beacon of his worst fears. He abandoned the car in the middle of the street and ran. He saw a small crowd gathered near the playground, and in the center of it, a small figure on a stretcher. Paramedics were working on him. Arthur pushed through the onlookers, his breath coming in ragged gasps. That's my son, he yelled, his voice raw. He fell to his knees beside the stretcher. Leo's face was chalky white, a stark contrast to the dark, matted blood in his brown hair. His eyes were closed. His small chest was still. Leo, Arthur whispered, his hand hovering over his son's face, afraid to touch him, afraid to find him cold. Leo, can you hear me? A paramedic, a young man with kind, tired eyes, put a hand on his shoulder. Sir, we need you to give us some space. We're doing everything we can. Is he breathing? He has a pulse, but it's weak. We need to get him to the hospital. Now, as they lifted the stretcher into the ambulance, Arthur's eyes scanned the crowd. He was looking for someone. A small girl. Maria's daughter. He saw her then, standing a little apart from the others, a small, blonde-haired girl in a faded pink jacket. She was tiny, no older than 9. Her face was pale, her blue eyes wide with a fear that mirrored his own. She was clutching an old, cracked cell phone in her hand. He walked over to her, his legs unsteady. "You're Lily?" She nodded, her eyes fixed on the ambulance. "You called me." "Yes, sir," she whispered. "I told him not to go so high. I told him it was dangerous." He looked down at her. She was just a child who had been the only one there for his son. He reached into his pocket for his wallet. It was an automatic gesture. "A problem arises, you solve it with money." "Thank you," he said, his voice thick. "I want to give you something for your trouble." He pulled out a thick wad of cash, but the girl took a step back, her eyes flashing with something he didn't expect. Pride. "No, sir," she said, her voice a little stronger now. "I don't want your money." He froze, his hand still outstretched. "What do you want?" She looked at him then, really looked at him, and what she said next would haunt him for the rest of his days. "I want you to be his father," she said quietly. "He talks about you all the time. He says you're the smartest man in the world. He just wants you to come to his baseball games sometimes." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He stared at the small girl, this child of his maid, and saw in her eyes a wisdom and a clarity that he, with all his wealth and power, had lost long ago. The ambulance doors slammed shut. The siren began to wail, a long, mournful sound that tore through the afternoon quiet. Arthur stood there, the money still in his hand, and watched it pull away, carrying his son, his life, his everything. And for the first time in a very long time, Arthur Vance felt completely and utterly bankrupt. He turned back to the girl. "Lily." She was still standing there, watching him. "What is your grandfather's name?" he asked, the question coming out of nowhere. She looked at him, confused. "My grandfather? He's gone. He was a soldier. My mom says he was a hero." He nodded slowly. He didn't know why he had asked that. He just knew, in that moment, that this little girl was more than just his maid's daughter. She was a link to a world he had forgotten existed. A world of courage, of loyalty, of love. A world that he had to find his way back to, if he was going to save his son. And himself. The hospital was a blur of sterile white and the smell of antiseptic. Arthur sat in a small, windowless waiting room, the kind of room designed for bad news. He had called his ex-wife, Sarah, on the way. She was on a plane from London, a business trip he had only vaguely been aware of. Her voice had been a tight, controlled fury over the phone. "How could you let this happen, Arthur? How could you not be there?" He had no answer. The question echoed in the silent room, a mantra of his own failure. He was a man who controlled everything, who built an empire from nothing, who could predict the market's every whim. But he couldn't protect his own son. He hadn't even been there. A 9-year-old girl had been there. A 9-year-old girl had called him. The shame of it was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He had spent the last hour on the phone, not to family, but to the best neurosurgeons in the country. He was flying in Dr. Evans from Johns Hopkins, a man who had pioneered a revolutionary treatment for traumatic brain injuries. He was arranging for a private suite, the best nurses, the most advanced equipment. He was doing what he always did, throwing money at a problem until it went away. But as he sat there, in the cold, plastic chair, he knew this was different. This was a bill he couldn't pay. A doctor in blue scrubs came in, his face etched with a professional sympathy that did nothing to comfort Arthur. "Mr. Vance? I'm Dr. Miller. We've done a CT scan. Leo has a severe concussion and a subdural hematoma. We need to operate to relieve the pressure on his brain." The words were a foreign language, a jumble of medical jargon that all meant the same thing. His son was in danger. "Will he be okay?" Arthur asked, his voice hoarse. "The next 24 hours are critical," the doctor said, his gaze steady. "The surgery is his best chance. Dr. Evans is on his way, but we can't wait. I need your consent to proceed." Arthur nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He signed the forms, his signature, usually a bold, decisive scrawl, now a shaky, barely legible line. As the doctor left, a woman appeared in the doorway. It was Maria, Lily's mother. She was still in her maid's uniform, a simple gray dress that seemed to make her fade into the pale walls of the hospital. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her knuckles white. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice soft. "I came as soon as I heard. Lily called me." "Is this Leo?" They're taking him into surgery, Arthur said, not meeting her eyes. She stepped into the room, her presence filling the small space with a quiet dignity that he found unnerving. I am so sorry, sir. Lily told me what happened. She's with a neighbor. She is very upset. She was very brave, Arthur said, the words feeling inadequate. Maria nodded, her eyes glistening. She loved Leo. He was always kind to her. He would read to her sometimes, in the library, while I cleaned. The image blindsided him. His son, in the vast, silent library that Arthur had built but never used, reading to the maid's daughter. A part of Leo's life he knew nothing about. It was another crack in the foundation of his world, another testament to his absence. She said something. Arthur began, looking at Maria now. About her grandfather. Maria's expression shifted, a flicker of surprise in her tired eyes. Her grandfather? My father. Yes. She said he was a soldier. A hero. A sad smile touched Maria's lips. He served in Vietnam. He was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry. He saved 3 men from a burning helicopter. She looked away, her gaze distant. It was a long time ago. He died when Lily was a baby. He never got to meet her. Arthur felt that strange pull again, that sense of a connection he couldn't yet understand. A war hero, a man of courage and sacrifice. Everything he wasn't. Why do you ask, Mr. Vance? Maria asked, her voice gentle. He shook his head. I don't know. But he did. He was grasping for something, anything, that felt real. In a world of balance sheets and stock tickers, the story of a brave soldier felt like solid ground. He looked at Maria, at her worn face and her calloused hands. She had nothing, by his standards. And yet, she had a daughter who knew what courage was, a father who was a hero, a connection to a legacy of honor. What did he have? A penthouse apartment filled with art he never looked at? A son who was a stranger to him? Maria, he said, his voice cracking. I haven't been a good father. The admission hung in the air between them. It was the truest thing he had said in years. Maria didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't say, Of course you are, sir. She just looked at him with an empathy that he didn't deserve. It is not too late, Mr. Vance, she said softly. Children have a way of forgiving. The doors to the operating room swung open, and a nurse called his name. It was time. Arthur stood up, his body feeling old and heavy. He walked towards the doors, towards the sterile room where his son's life hung in the balance. And as he walked, he carried Maria's words with him, a fragile, flickering flame in the overwhelming darkness. It is not too late. He had to believe she was right. For Leo's sake. And for his own. The surgery felt like an eternity. Arthur paced the waiting room, the coffee he drank turning to acid in his stomach. He tried to work, to lose himself in the familiar comfort of numbers, but the figures on his tablet were just a meaningless jumble. Every time a door opened, his head would snap up, his heart lurching with a desperate hope. Dr. Evans, the world-renowned surgeon he had flown in from Baltimore, finally emerged, his face grim. Arthur's blood ran cold. Mr. Vance, Dr. Evans began, his voice low. The surgery was a success in that we were able to remove the hematoma and relieve the pressure on the brain. But Leo's condition is still extremely critical. There was more swelling than we anticipated. He's in a medically induced coma to allow his brain to heal. We won't know the extent of the damage for some time. Damage? Arthur repeated, the word a poison on his tongue. What kind of damage? It could be anything. Arthur, the doctor said, dropping the formal title. They had known each other for years, moving in the same circles of wealth and influence. Memory loss, cognitive impairment, motor skill issues. Or, he might make a full recovery. It's impossible to say right now. We just have to wait. Wait. It was the one thing Arthur Vance had never learned how to do. He was allowed to see Leo a few hours later. The private room was filled with the soft beeping and whirring of machines. Leo looked so small in the large hospital bed, a network of tubes and wires connecting him to the blinking monitors. His head was bandaged, his face pale and still. Arthur pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down, his hand hovering over his son's. He was afraid to touch him, afraid of the fragility of the small body, of the life that was hanging by a thread. He finally reached out and gently took Leo's hand. It was warm. Leo, he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. It's Dad. I'm here. I'm so sorry, son. I'm so sorry. He sat there for hours, holding his son's hand, talking to him, telling him stories about his own childhood, about his grandfather, about the time he had fallen out of a tree and broken his arm. He talked until his throat was raw, filling the sterile silence of the room with the sound of his voice, a desperate attempt to bridge the gulf that had grown between them. He didn't know when he fell asleep, but he woke to a soft touch on his shoulder. It was Maria. She was holding 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you might need this," she said, her voice a gentle whisper. He took the cup, his hands shaking. "Thank you, Maria. You didn't have to do this. Lily wanted to come," she said, looking over at Leo. "But I told her it was best to wait." She drew him a picture. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket and handed it to him. Arthur unfolded it. It was a child's drawing, done in bright, cheerful crayons. A picture of 2 stick figures, a boy and a girl, holding hands under a big, smiling sun. Underneath, in a child's wobbly handwriting, it said, "Get better soon, Leo. Your friend, Lily." A wave of emotion washed over him, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. This little girl, this stranger, had shown his son more friendship and care than he, his own father, had in years. "Maria," he said, his voice choked. "Tell me more about your father." The question seemed to surprise her, but she sat down in the chair on the other side of the bed. "His name was Joseph," she began, her voice soft with memory. "Joseph Chavez. He was a good man. Quiet. Kind. He never talked much about the war. But my mother told me stories. She said he was the bravest man she ever knew." "What happened to him?" Arthur asked. "He was injured," she said, her eyes distant. "Shrapnel. It stayed with him. The doctors said it was too dangerous to remove. He was in pain for the rest of his life. But he never complained. He worked 2 jobs to provide for us. He always said his family was his real medal of honor." Arthur looked at his son, lying so still in the bed. He thought of this man, Joseph Chavez, a man who had endured so much, who had sacrificed everything for his family. And he thought of himself, a man who had everything and had sacrificed nothing. "Maria," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I need to ask you a favor." "A favor?" Maria asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Anything, sir." Arthur looked from his son's still face to this woman who radiated a quiet strength he couldn't comprehend. "I know this is a strange request," he began, his voice low and hesitant. "But would you be willing to tell me more about your father? About Joseph? And if it's not too much to ask, is there anything you have of his? Something I could see." He felt foolish as soon as the words were out. A billionaire asking his cleaning lady for a memento of her dead father. It was absurd. He expected her to refuse, to look at him with the disdain he deserved. But Maria simply nodded, her expression unreadable. "I have his medal," she said. "The Silver Star. My mother gave it to me when she passed. It's all I have left of him. Could you bring it?" Arthur asked, the plea in his voice raw and undisguised. I need to understand what it means to be a man like that. A man who fights for something more than himself." Maria looked at him for a long moment, and in her eyes, he didn't see a maid looking at her employer. He saw a woman looking at a broken man. "I will bring it tomorrow," she said softly. And with that, she stood up and left, leaving Arthur alone once more with the beeping machines and the silent form of his son. The next morning brought Sarah. She swept into the hospital room like a hurricane, a whirlwind of expensive perfume, designer clothes, and righteous anger. She was a strikingly beautiful woman, her face a carefully constructed mask of perfection that even grief couldn't entirely crack. "Arthur," she said, her voice like ice. "I came as soon as I could. I can't believe this happened." She went to Leo's bedside, her hand hovering over his forehead, her long, manicured nails a stark contrast to his pale skin. She didn't touch him. "The doctors said there's no change," Arthur said, his voice flat. He had been up all night, watching, waiting. Sarah rounded on him, her eyes flashing. "No change? That's not good enough, Arthur. What are you paying these people for? I want a second opinion. I want him moved to a private clinic in Switzerland. I've already made some calls." "Sarah, stop," he said, his voice weary. "He's getting the best care in the world. Dr. Evans is the top man in his field. Moving him is too risky." "Risky?" "It was risky leaving him in the care of a maid," she shot back, her voice rising. "Where were you, Arthur? Closing another deal? Counting your money?" The accusations were a familiar refrain in their long and bitter history. But for the first time, they didn't ignite his anger. They just landed with a dull, heavy thud of truth. He was guilty. "I was at the office," he said quietly, "and Maria's daughter saved his life. She was the one who called for help. She was the one who was there when I wasn't." Sarah let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Oh, please, don't try to make a hero out of the help. This is your fault, Arthur. And you know it." Just then, the door opened, and Maria walked in. She was holding a small, velvet-covered box. She stopped short when she saw Sarah, her eyes widening in surprise. Sarah turned, her gaze sweeping over Maria's simple dress with undisguised contempt. "What is she doing here?" she demanded, looking at Arthur. "I asked her to come," Arthur said, his voice firm. He stood up and walked over to Maria, deliberately positioning himself between her and his ex-wife. Maria held out the box to him, her hand trembling slightly. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is it." Arthur took the box. It was old, the velvet worn smooth with time. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded silk, was a silver star hanging from a red, white, and blue ribbon. It was simple, unadorned, but it seemed to hum with a quiet power. "What is that?" Sarah asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "It's a silver star," Arthur said, his eyes fixed on the metal. "It belonged to Maria's father. He was a hero." Sarah stared at him as if he had lost his mind. "A hero? He was probably a janitor. And what does that have to do with my son?" A cold, hard anger, unlike anything he had felt before, rose in Arthur's chest. It was not the hot, explosive anger of a business deal gone wrong. It was a still, quiet rage. A rage on behalf of a good man he had never met, and on behalf of the quiet, dignified woman who stood beside him. "His name was Joseph Chavez," Arthur said, his voice low and dangerous. "And he saved 3 men from a burning helicopter in Vietnam. He was awarded that medal for gallantry in the face of the enemy. He spent the rest of his life in pain from his injuries, but he never complained. He worked 2 jobs to raise his family. So don't you dare stand there in your $1,000 shoes and insult a man you know nothing about." Sarah was stunned into silence. She had never heard Arthur speak like that. He had always been a man of cold, calculated logic. This raw, passionate defense of a stranger was completely out of character. He turned his back on her and looked at Maria. "Thank you for bringing this," he said, his voice softening. "It means more than you know." He walked back to Leo's bedside, the small box in his hand. He sat down and gently placed it on the table next to his son. He looked at the metal, then at Leo's face. He thought of Joseph Chavez, of his courage, his sacrifice. And he made a silent vow, to his son, to himself, and to the memory of a man he had never known. He would be a better man. He would be a father worthy of his son. He would learn what it meant to fight for something more than money, more than power, more than himself. He would learn to be a hero, not on a battlefield, but in the quiet, sterile room of a hospital, where his son was fighting the greatest battle of his life. And as he sat there, holding Leo's hand, he felt a faint pressure in return. A tiny, almost imperceptible squeeze. His head snapped up, his heart pounding in his chest. "Leo," he whispered, his eyes wide with a desperate, fragile hope. "Leo, can you hear me?" The room was silent, save for the steady rhythm of the machines. But Arthur knew what he had felt. It was a flicker of a promise, a sign that his son was still with him, and it was enough. For the first time since the phone call that had shattered his world, Arthur Vance felt a sliver of peace. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but he was no longer walking it alone. He had his son, he had the memory of a hero, and he had a promise to keep. Days bled into one another, each marked by the steady, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. The faint squeeze of Leo's hand was a memory Arthur clung to, a tiny island of hope in a vast ocean of uncertainty. The doctors called it an involuntary reflex, a neurological ghost. They warned him not to get his hopes up, but Arthur knew what he had felt. It was a connection, a message from the silent world his son now inhabited. Sarah did not share his optimism. She saw his vigil as a pointless, sentimental exercise. "He can't hear you, Arthur," she said, her voice a sharp, brittle thing in the quiet room. "You're wasting your time. You should be managing this situation, not narrating his bedtime stories." She stayed for another day, making calls, consulting with specialists, treating Leo's condition like a hostile takeover. Then, convinced that Arthur had lost his grip on reality, she flew back to London, leaving behind a trail of expensive perfume and a chill that lingered in the air. Arthur was relieved when she left. Her presence was a jarring reminder of his old life, a life of cold transactions and emotional sterility. He didn't want that life anymore. He wanted this. He wanted the quiet intimacy of this room, the simple, profound act of holding his son's hand. His business empire, the vast, intricate machine he had built from the ground up, began to shudder and groan in his absence. Helen, his assistant, called a dozen times a day, her voice increasingly strained. "Mr. Vance, the board is demanding a meeting. The stockholders are getting nervous. Our stock has dropped 3 points. Sell off the subsidiary in Asia," he told her, his eyes never leaving Leo's face. "Sir? But that's your pet project. You spent 5 years building that. Sell it," he repeated, his voice calm. "It's just money, Helen." The world he had once commanded was shrinking, its frantic demands fading into a distant hum. His new world was the 4 walls of this hospital room, the rise and fall of his son's chest, the feel of a small hand in his. Maria and Lily were a constant, quiet presence in this new world. They would arrive every evening after Maria finished her shift. Maria would bring him a container of homemade soup or a sandwich, her gentle insistence breaking through the fog of his grief and exhaustion. She never stayed long, just long enough to offer a few words of comfort, her presence a calming balm in the sterile environment. Lily, however, would pull a chair up to Leo's bedside and talk to him as if he were simply asleep. She told him about her day at school, about the book she was reading, about the funny thing the mailman's dog had done. She would tape her drawings to the wall until the room was a riot of color, a child's vibrant imagination pushing back against the sterile white. One evening, Lily brought a small, worn paperback book. "This was my grandpa's favorite," she said to Leo, holding up the book. "It's about a man who gets lost at sea. My mom says Grandpa read it a dozen times." She opened the book and began to read aloud, her small, clear voice filling the room. Arthur sat in the corner, watching and listening. He watched this little girl, who had so little, give so freely of her time, her heart. He listened to the words of the story, a simple tale of survival and hope against impossible odds. And he felt a profound sense of peace. He learned more about Joseph Chavez in these quiet evening visits. Maria spoke of him with a daughter's love, but also with an unvarnished honesty. She told him about her father's nightmares, the ghosts of the war that haunted his sleep. She told him about his struggles to find work, his pride that made him refuse any charity. She told him about his quiet acts of kindness, the way he would fix a neighbor's fence or share his meager garden with those who had less. "He wasn't a saint, Mr. Vance," she said one evening, as they stood together in the hallway while Lily read to Leo. "He was just a man who tried to do the right thing, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard." The words resonated deep within him. He thought of his own father, a ruthless, brilliant man who had taught him that the world was a battlefield and the only goal was to win. He had taught him how to be powerful. He had never taught him how to be good. A week after the accident, Arthur was in the hospital cafeteria, forcing down a cup of bitter coffee, when his phone buzzed. It was Helen. "Mr. Vance, you need to come to the office. Now, the board has called an emergency meeting. They're talking about invoking the key man clause in your contract. They're trying to oust you." The threat was real. He could lose everything he had spent his life building. The old Arthur Vance would have been on fire, a whirlwind of calculated rage and strategic maneuvering. He would have crushed the opposition, reminded them all who was in charge. But as he stood there, the cheap, lukewarm coffee in his hand, he felt nothing. The empire he had built felt like a house of cards, a meaningless game. His son was upstairs, fighting for his life. That was the only battle that mattered. "Let them," he said, his voice calm. "Sir." Helen's voice was a squeak of disbelief. "Tell the board. Tell them I'll be there this afternoon. But I have something more important to do first." He hung up and went back to Leo's room. He stood by the bed, looking down at his son. He reached out and touched his cheek. It was still so pale, but he looked peaceful. "Leo," he whispered, "I have to go out for a little while. But I'll be back. I promise. I'm not going anywhere." He leaned down and kissed his son's forehead. And as he did, Leo's eyelids fluttered. A tiny, almost imperceptible movement. Arthur froze, his heart stopping in his chest. He watched, holding his breath. It happened again. A flicker, a tremor. A nurse, who had come in to check the monitors, saw it too. Her eyes widened. "Doctor," she called out, her voice sharp with urgency. "Get Dr. Evans in here. Now." The room was suddenly a flurry of activity. Doctors and nurses rushed in, surrounding the bed. Arthur was pushed to the side, his mind reeling. It was happening. Something was happening. He stood by the window, his hands pressed against the cool glass, and watched as they worked on his son. He prayed. To a God he wasn't sure he believed in. He prayed for a miracle. After what felt like a lifetime, Dr. Evans came over to him, a look of cautious wonder on his face. "Arthur," he said, his voice low. "His brain activity is increasing. He's responding to stimuli. He's starting to come out of the coma." The words washed over him, a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees. He staggered to the bedside. Leo's eyes were still closed, but there was a new tension in his face, a sense of a mind stirring beneath the surface. "Leo," Arthur whispered, his voice thick with tears. "Can you hear me, son? It's Dad." Slowly, as if through a great and heavy fog, Leo's eyes began to open. They were unfocused at first, hazy and confused. But then they found Arthur's face, and a flicker of recognition, of memory, of love, sparked in their depths. "Dad." The voice was a dry, rasping whisper, but it was the most beautiful sound Arthur had ever heard. Tears streamed down Arthur's face as he laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. "I'm here, Leo," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm here." He had his son back. He had his son back. Nothing else mattered. The company, the board, the billions, it was all just dust. This was real. This was everything. He didn't go to the board meeting that afternoon. He didn't even call. He stayed by Leo's side, holding his hand, talking to him, laughing with him. He was a father again. Late that night, after Leo had fallen into a natural, peaceful sleep, Arthur sat in the quiet room, the city lights twinkling outside the window. He took out the small, velvet box Maria had given him. He opened it and looked at the silver star. He thought about Joseph Chavez, the quiet hero who had fought for his country and his family. And he thought about his own father, the corporate raider who had taught him to fight for himself. He had spent his life following in his father's footsteps. But now, he knew he had been on the wrong path. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Not to his assistant, but to the head of the Veterans Administration. "My name is Arthur Vance," he said, his voice clear and steady. "I want to make a donation. A substantial one. I want to fund a new wing for the VA hospital. A wing dedicated to soldiers suffering from traumatic brain injuries." He paused, then added, "And I want to name it after a man named Joseph Chavez. He was a hero. It's time people knew his name." As he hung up the phone, he felt a lightness he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just a rich man anymore. He was a son. He was a father. And he was finally, after all these years, starting to understand what it meant to be a man. Leo's recovery was slow, a painstaking process of small victories. The first time he sat up. The first time he took a step, leaning heavily on Arthur and a physical therapist. The first time he smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes, was when Lily brought in a shoebox containing a stray kitten she had found. Arthur, who had never allowed so much as a goldfish in his pristine penthouse, found himself agreeing to adopt the tiny, scruffy creature, which Leo immediately named Comet. The hospital room became a strange, makeshift home. It was filled with Lily's drawings, the scent of Maria's cooking, and the soft purring of a kitten. Arthur canceled all his meetings, ignored the increasingly frantic calls from his office, and learned the simple, profound rhythms of being a caregiver. He learned how to read a thermometer, how to coax his son into eating a few more bites of Jell-O, how to tell a silly bedtime story that ended with both of them laughing. He discovered a son he had never known. He learned that Leo was fascinated by astronomy, that his favorite food was macaroni and cheese from a box, and that he had a quiet, sharp sense of humor. They spent hours talking, not about business or school, but about stars and superheroes, about dreams and fears. The gulf that had separated them for so long was slowly, painstakingly being filled. One afternoon, Maria arrived with a framed photograph. It was an old, black-and-white picture of a young man in a soldier's uniform. He had a kind, serious face and eyes that seemed to hold a deep and quiet sadness. "This was my father," she said, handing the picture to Arthur. I thought Leo might like to see the man who the new hospital wing is named after." Arthur took the photograph and showed it to Leo. "This is Joseph Chavez," he said, his voice soft. "He was a hero." Leo looked at the picture for a long time, his small face serious. "He looked sad," he said. "I think maybe all heroes are a little sad," Arthur replied, the words coming to him unbidden. "Because they've seen things that the rest of us haven't." The news of Arthur's donation had made the papers. It was a move that had stunned the business world. Arthur Vance, the ruthless corporate shark, giving away a fortune? It didn't make sense. The media portrayed it as a calculated PR move, a way to distract from his company's plummeting stock prices. They didn't know the truth. They couldn't understand that he wasn't trying to save his company. He was trying to save his soul. His old life finally caught up with him one rainy Tuesday. A man in a sharp suit, a lawyer from his company's board, appeared at the hospital, his face a mask of grim determination. "Arthur," he said, dispensing with any pleasantries. "It's over. The board has voted you out. They've appointed an interim CEO. You've lost the company." Arthur looked at the man, at his expensive suit and his cold, empty eyes. He felt a strange sense of detachment, as if they were talking about someone else. He looked over at Leo, who was sitting up in bed, sketching a picture of Comet in a notebook. "Okay," Arthur said, his voice calm. The lawyer stared at him, dumbfounded. "Okay, that's it. Okay. Arthur, this is your life's work. Aren't you going to fight?" Arthur thought for a moment. He thought of the endless meetings, the sleepless nights, the relentless, gnawing hunger for more. He thought of the man he had been, a man who had $100 billion and a son who was a stranger. "No," he said, a small smile touching his lips. "I'm not going to fight. They can have it." He walked over to Leo's bed and put a hand on his son's shoulder. "I already have everything I need right here." The lawyer left, shaking his head in disbelief. Arthur Vance, the titan of industry, had just given up his empire without a fight. The news would be all over the financial channels by morning. But Arthur didn't care. He was free. Leo's recovery continued, and soon, the doctors were talking about releasing him. The day he finally walked out of the hospital, leaning on a cane but smiling brightly, was the happiest day of Arthur's life. He didn't take him back to the cold, silent penthouse. Instead, he drove to a small, unassuming house in a quiet, tree-lined suburb, a house he had bought the week before. It had a backyard, perfect for a boy and a kitten to play in. Maria and Lily were there to greet them. Maria had prepared a simple, delicious meal, and Lily had decorated Leo's new room with her drawings and a large, hand-painted welcome home sign. As they sat around the dining room table that evening, a chaotic, happy group, Arthur looked at his son, at his laughing face, and felt a sense of contentment that all his billions had never been able to buy. He had lost an empire, but he had gained a family. But the ghosts of his past were not so easily banished. A few weeks later, a letter arrived. It was from a law firm, representing a group of former employees from a company he had acquired and dismantled years ago. They were suing him, claiming he had illegally and unethically stripped the company's assets, robbing them of their pensions. The lawsuit was a brutal reminder of the man he used to be. The accusations were true. He had been ruthless, unfeeling. He had seen the employees not as people, but as numbers on a balance sheet. He had destroyed their lives and never given it a second thought. His lawyers advised him to fight. They said they could tie the case up in court for years, that they could bankrupt the plaintiffs with legal fees. The old Arthur Vance would have relished the battle. But he was a different man now. He called Maria and asked if he could speak with her. They met in a small park, not far from the one where Leo had had his accident. He told her everything. About the lawsuit, about the man he had been, about the shame that now consumed him. "I don't know what to do," he confessed, his voice heavy. "If I fight, I become that man again. If I settle, it feels like I'm just throwing money at the problem, buying my way out of guilt." Maria listened patiently, her hands clasped in her lap. When he was finished, she was silent for a long time. Then she said, "My father used to say that you can't erase the past, but you can make amends." "How?" Arthur asked, his voice a desperate plea. "You cannot give these people back their jobs," she said, her voice gentle. "You cannot give them back the years they have lost. But you can give them something else. You can give them dignity." He looked at her, not understanding. "Meet with them," she said. "Don't send your lawyers. Go yourself. Look them in the eye. And apologize." The thought terrified him. To face the people whose lives he had ruined? To admit his own monstrousness? It was the hardest thing he could imagine. But as he looked into Maria's clear, steady eyes, he knew she was right. It was the only way. It was what a man like Joseph Chavez would have done. It was what he had to do. He arranged the meeting, not in a sterile law office, but in a community hall in the town where the factory had once stood. He walked in alone, without lawyers, without bodyguards. The room was filled with dozens of men and women, their faces etched with years of hardship and resentment. The silence was thick with a palpable hatred. He stood before them, his hands shaking, his heart pounding. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He looked at their faces, at the anger and the pain in their eyes. And he saw himself, for the first time, not as a titan of industry, but as a destroyer of worlds. And he began to speak. Not the carefully crafted words of a lawyer, but the simple, unvarnished truth. "I am here," he said, his voice cracking, "to say that I am sorry." He told them everything. He didn't spare himself. He spoke of his greed, his ambition, his callous disregard for their lives. He explained the cold, ruthless logic he had used to justify his actions, the way he had reduced their years of loyal service to mere numbers on a spreadsheet. He didn't make excuses. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply laid the ugliness of his past bare for them all to see. When he finished, the silence in the room was different. It was no longer a silence of pure hatred. It was thick with confusion, with shock, with 100 different emotions warring for dominance. He stood before them, exposed and vulnerable, and waited for their judgment. An old man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and hard times, stood up. Arthur recognized him from the files. His name was George. He had been the factory's foreman for 40 years. He had been 2 years from retirement when Arthur had shut it down. "Sorry doesn't pay the bills, Mr. Vance," George said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Sorry doesn't get my pension back. Sorry doesn't change the fact that my wife had to go without her medicine because of what you did." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The anger was still there, a simmering coal bed just beneath the surface. "I know," Arthur said, his voice quiet but clear. "I know it doesn't. And that's why I'm not just here to apologize. I am turning over the entirety of my remaining personal assets to a trust fund. That fund will be managed by a committee, and you will elect that committee. Its purpose is to repay every cent of the pensions that were lost, with interest. And any money left over will be used to create a new community investment fund to help start new businesses in this town." He had their attention now. A stunned silence fell over the room. They had come expecting a fight, a denial, a lowball settlement offer from a team of slick lawyers. They had not expected this. They had not expected a complete and total surrender. "And one more thing," Arthur said, his voice gaining a strength he didn't know he possessed. "This isn't a settlement. I am not asking you to drop your lawsuit. You should proceed. You deserve your day in court. You deserve to have a judge and jury hear what was done to you. This trust fund, it is not a legal maneuver. It is an act of restitution. It is the only thing I can do to begin to set things right." He looked from face to face, meeting their gazes without flinching. "I can't give you back what you lost," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer contain. "But I can give you back your future, and I can give you justice." He turned and walked out of the community hall, leaving behind a room full of people who had come to hate him, and who now had to reckon with a man who was nothing like the monster they had imagined. The legal battle was messy and public. The media had a field day with the story of the fallen billionaire who had given away his fortune. Some called him a fool, others a saint. Arthur ignored it all. He lived quietly in the small suburban house, his life now revolving around Leo's physical therapy appointments, little league games, and helping Lily with her homework. He had found a new kind of wealth. It wasn't the cold, hard currency of the stock market. It was the warmth of his son's hand in his, the sound of Lily's laughter, the quiet wisdom in Maria's eyes. It was the simple, profound joy of a shared meal, a bedtime story, a purring kitten curled up on the end of the bed. He attended every court hearing. He sat and listened as the former employees, one by one, told their stories. He listened to their pain, their anger, their despair. He didn't try to defend himself. He simply bore witness to the wreckage he had created. In the end, the jury found him liable. The judgment was staggering, but the trust fund he had established was more than enough to cover it. The story was over. The headlines faded. The world moved on. One crisp autumn afternoon, a few months later, Arthur was in the backyard, raking leaves with Leo. It had become their ritual. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. They were laughing, engaged in a mock ferocious battle, throwing piles of golden and crimson leaves at each other, when Arthur saw an unfamiliar car pull up in front of the house. A man got out. It was George, the old factory foreman. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. His laughter died. He walked slowly to the front of the house, wiping stray leaves from his sweater, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. "George," he said, his voice cautious, uncertain. George stood on the sidewalk, his hands in his pockets. He looked older than he had in the community hall, but the hardness in his eyes had softened. "Vance," he said, his voice still gruff, but lacking its former venom. He held out a hand. "I was in the area. Just came to say, the fund is working. A couple of the boys opened up a new machine shop. My daughter's starting a little bakery on Main Street. My son-in-law, Mike, got a loan. Opened up that garage he's been dreaming about since high school. Hired 2 of the old factory guys." He paused, a flicker of something new in his gaze. "The town, it's starting to breathe again." Arthur didn't know what to say. The words were a balm on a wound he thought would never heal. "I'm glad, George. I'm so glad to hear that." George looked past him, at Leo, who had abandoned the leaves and was now engaged in a fierce, tumbling wrestling match with Comet, the kitten. "That your boy?" he asked. "Yes," Arthur said, a proud, involuntary smile spreading across his face. "That's Leo." George nodded slowly, watching them for a long moment. "He looks like a good kid." He turned his gaze back to Arthur. "You know, for the longest time, I prayed for bad things to happen to you. Every night. I wanted you to suffer the way we suffered, to feel what it was like to have everything you built torn down." He looked down at his own worn, calloused hands. "But I was wrong. Revenge, it turns out it's just a different kind of prison." He looked up again, and for the first time, Arthur saw not anger or forgiveness in his eyes, but a kind of weary, hard-won peace. "What you did, it wasn't about the money. You gave us our dignity back. And in a funny way, I think maybe you got yours back, too." He turned and walked back to his car without another word, leaving Arthur standing on the lawn, the autumn leaves swirling around his feet as if in a sudden wind. Arthur watched him drive away, a profound stillness settling over him. He had been so focused on the mechanics of restitution, on the numbers and the legalities, that he hadn't truly understood the human impact. Dignity. The word echoed in the quiet afternoon. He had stripped them of it, and in trying to restore theirs, he had stumbled upon his own. That evening, the 4 of them, Arthur, Leo, Maria, and Lily, sat around the small dining room table. The house was filled with the warm, comforting smell of Maria's cooking. Lily was chattering excitedly about a school project on the solar system. Leo was explaining the finer points of a curveball, and Comet was sleeping peacefully in a patch of moonlight on the rug. Arthur looked at the faces around him, his heart full to bursting. He had lost an empire, a fortune, a life he had spent decades building. And in its place, he had found this. This small, noisy, chaotic, beautiful life. He had found a home. He thought of Joseph Chavez, the quiet hero he had never known, but whose legacy of quiet courage had changed the course of his life. He had finally learned that true strength wasn't about power or control. It was about sacrifice, about responsibility, about the quiet, steadfast refusal to look away from the pain of others. It was about doing the right thing, especially when it was hard. Later that night, after Leo was asleep, Arthur stood by his son's window, looking out at the star-filled sky. He saw Comet, not the kitten, but the constellation, a faint, hopeful streak of light against the vast, dark canvas of the universe. He was no longer the man who owned the world. He was just a man, flawed and scarred, who was trying every day to find his way. But he was no longer lost. He had his son. He had a family. He had a second chance. And as he stood there, in the quiet stillness of the night, he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was the richest man in the world. He had finally learned that the most valuable things in life are not the things you own, but the things you hold in your heart. And his heart, for the first time in a very long time, was full. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comments section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.